In today's video, I am talking to my good friend Clare Johnston from the Honest channel, who I know most of you already know and love. Claire and I had a conversation the other day, and amongst many other things, we talked about how there are seemingly so many conflicting opinions on diets. That led us to talk about our own past struggles around food. Both Claire and I had an eating disorder. I was anorexic, Claire was bulimic, and how those past struggles still play a role in our life to this day. And we thought this might be an interesting and hopefully helpful conversation to tape. Claire, thank you so much for being here and having this conversation with me.
Oh, you're so welcome. Any excuse to talk to you, I'm there.
Thank you, likewise. Now, Claire, you and I talked the other day just amongst friends, and we were surprised that every time we post something about nutrition, we get these conflicting comments and opinions on it, which is totally fine. But that got us to talk about our own past with food and our own struggles with food in the past, and some still in the present. And we thought that hopefully taping this conversation would be helpful to people, because I know, and I've shared this before, I've been a personal trainer for half of my life, and I've worked with so many, not just women, but also men who don't necessarily have a full-blown eating disorder, but have disordered eating, meaning they just don't quite have a healthy relationship with food. And I think nowadays, in the world we live in, it's quite challenging to have that, because first of all, there are these opposing opinions on, the carnivores and the meat eaters and the fruitarians, and then there's so many different things and debates on what our body is meant to be eating. But then we're also bombarded with all these different, I wouldn't even call them foods anymore. I told you we went to Costco the other day, my husband and I haven't lived in the United States for 7 years, so it was a bit shocking to see just these aisles of packaged foods that I wouldn't even consider food anymore at this point. They're so highly processed. So I think it is quite challenging in today's world to have a healthy relationship with food. And you and I definitely have had our struggles with that, to an extreme, more extreme than most people. But tell us just briefly, and we are doing this conversation on your channel as well, so just for people to know, this is a two-part conversation because there is a lot to talk about. But tell us just really briefly a little bit about your struggles.
I think actually mine started with that overwhelm of food availability when I was a young adult. So when I was 20, I went to the States to do the Work America program. So I was based in Maryland, and I worked in an all-you-can-eat smorgasbord. And we were given our lunch and dinner there. And I mean, I had traveled over from Scotland, and I had grown up, really quite a skinny girl, very sweet tooth, love sweet things. But our meals had been conservative at home, so we would typically have been given meat and two veg, or spaghetti bolognese if we were really going for it. But, I had eaten very conservatively, and being confronted with this smorgasbord every day that we could just help ourselves to, I had no idea that the food would be quite so fattening, because I didn't appreciate at the time that, eating sort of fried foods every day and heavily processed foods, I would take a little bun for my lunch with some cottage cheese. I didn't realize that the bun was loaded with sugar and, pretty bad fats. And so it was very confusing to me when all of a sudden I started to pile on weight really quickly. And the confusion around that and the loss of control with food. Suddenly food wasn't my friend. It was really quite scary. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what the safe options were. We didn't have the information available at that time. We didn't have the internet. So I think the only thing I could think to do in that situation was obviously a bad choice. And there was something in me different to a lot of other people where I decided to make that choice was I would throw up to try and control my weight, basically. And when I moved back to the UK, so I was out there for 4 months, I had put on 2 stone. So I think that would be something like 28 pounds. You know, my granddad greeted me at the airport with his face like this when he saw me, you know, and it was really like, oh no, it's really obvious. And so I did lose weight by settling back into the old eating routines, but my relationship with food had changed forever. The sort of the trust had gone, or I say forever. I think I've got it back. The trust had gone, and so you know, I would sort of try and eat smaller amounts than I would have done previously, and then if I felt I'd lost control, or sometimes just the trying to control everything and suppress what I wanted to eat would kind of erupt, and I would binge on food, and then I would bring it all back up. So unfortunately, that became a pattern for me that would sort of flare up, and then it would settle for a little while, and it would flare up again. And it really went on throughout my 20s, less so in my later 20s. But I would get the odd flare up, and usually triggered by an emotional event, which I didn't connect until I actually went for therapy in my mid-20s, and the therapist asked me to kind of, next time it happened, make a mental note of what I was feeling in that situation. And it was an incredibly helpful thing to do, because I realized there was a connection. It wasn't just about food. It was about the way I was feeling about myself. It was times when I felt lonely, when I felt overwhelmed, but always underpinned by a lack of self-worth, not feeling good enough, feeling like, yeah, this is me. I'm someone who, you know, can't control what I eat, and this is what I have to do. And this is just a kind of shameful secret that I carry with me. I'd had a very religious upbringing, and sin, you know, we were all told we were sinners 4 times every Sunday that I went to the different services, and it just kind of all stuck with me. You know, I just felt like a great sense of shame and lack of self-worth, and this all came together with what was ultimately an eating disorder that took me some time to unpick and put right in my mind.
And obviously what you're talking about is an extreme, you know, bulimia is an extreme, it's an eating disorder. It's just like anorexia, and I really dislike the term, but it is a mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, like I said, I've worked with so many people who have disordered eating. It's this vicious cycle, because first of all, the foods that I just mentioned that are in Costco and packages, these foods, they trigger our dopamine receptors. Dopamine is make you feel good neurotransmitter, so they trigger our dopamine receptors. So you want to eat those foods, but then you eat those foods and you gain weight and you don't feel good about yourself. So you want to eat more. It's this vicious cycle.
Absolutely. And until you have some basic knowledge around food and kind of understand what you're eating. And I think, you know, the internet is helpful for that. People are beginning to grow an awareness around it. But when I changed to just eating naturally, you know, as nature intended, whole foods, that did change everything for me. And I think probably just getting that nutritional balance back, everything that does for us chemically in our brains, you know, the whole thing just sort of came together. But there is an emotional side to it. The two things need to be tackled when you're talking about eating disorder. But day to day, for most people who are maybe struggling with weight, I mean, it will obviously a lot of the time come down to just the choices that you're making, and some of the foods that we eat set us up for failure, and we end up feeling bad, shame, blame ourselves, when in actual fact it's the food, not us.
Mm-hmm. But I would go as far as to say that even if you don't have a full-blown eating disorder, there's often an emotional aspect still, because food is supposed to be very simple, right? It's nourishment. You put gas in your car, so it performs. We put food in our body so we can do the things we want to do. But I think so many of us, food has an emotional aspect. For me, it was love growing up. It's the only love I knew. For many, it's trying to stuff down emotions. It's not as simple as just, I eat when I'm hungry, what's good for my body, and I stop when I'm full. because we live in this world where food has become so many other things.
Yeah, and it can be how we're raised. I mean, you can be raised in an environment where you've never eaten healthily. You don't know where to begin with that, and it's a lot for people to unpick, and that brings with it the kind of emotional baggage of how we feel when we feel we're failing at eating, something that you and I obviously understand fully.
Yeah. And as you said earlier, when you eat the right foods, which there's a big debate about what are the right foods, but when you eat foods in the whole form, it does affect your brain chemistry. It affects your gut microbiome, where we produce neurotransmitters, so it does affect your brain chemistry. Getting there then helps you to, continue, but getting there first is the difficult part.
Yeah, because you're controlling the cravings. The move to eating naturally, everything sort of tends to fall into place because you're not craving food so much. So just cutting out the processed stuff, trying to cut back on sugar, stopping eating before I feel full was another really helpful thing for me, particularly with what I was going through, because it would be the fullness and that sense of loss of control that was very difficult for me. So, I mean, these were some things that once I put into place, I felt that all the kind of cravings and the difficulty in kind of feeling a sense of control over food, that vanished, and food started to become my friend again, which is a great place to be, thankfully.
Yes, definitely.
How about you, Claudia? I mean, how did it all start for you?
For me, it started very early on in my childhood. I grew up with a very cold and distant mother, and the only form of love she knew how to give was to feed us. And so my mother would really overfeed us. She would stuff us, basically. So we had nice round red cheeks, and people would say, "Look how healthy these little girls look." And I was very young. I think I was about age 4. And obviously now I can't remember consciously making this decision. But back then I stopped eating. And I think I thought, if this is the only form of love I get, then I don't want any of it. So my mother would try to stuff me, and I wouldn't open my mouth. And eventually she invited her best friend over, who I loved. And she was very funny, and she would tell me jokes. And when I would laugh, my mom would stuff the spoon in my mouth. So very early on, I decided this is not the kind of love I want. And then this power struggle continued throughout my whole childhood. Eventually, I started eating again because I was scared into eating again. And then I don't even know if it was realistically that I was overeating, or if it's just in my mother's mind I was overeating. My mother, in hindsight, did not have a healthy relationship with food either. And so then she told me now I was eating too much suddenly. And she even took me to a few doctors and said, "What's wrong with my daughter? Why is she eating so much?" And I still remember one of them saying, "Maybe you need to spend a bit of time with her." And of course, she didn't like to hear that. So there was my whole childhood, there was this power struggle around food. My mother trying to stuff me or tell me I was eating too much, and me sort of countering that. And then at age 16, I had gone on vacation and lost a couple of pounds. Now, mind you, I was never overweight. I felt overweight. My whole childhood, I felt like this just big klutz.
Wow.
And looking back at pictures now, I had a gorgeous figure, but I didn't know it because my mother kept telling me, "Your butt is getting too big, and we have to buy you sizes too big for your age." Well, I was tall also, but so my whole life I thought I was just this big klutz. And my mother also always told me, "You're not athletic, so don't even bother." So I didn't work out. And at age 16, I went on vacation and lost a bit of weight. And I came back, and this big fuss was made around me having lost a couple of pounds, especially by my mother's boyfriend, who was not a safe person. He had done some horrible things to my sister and I.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Thank you. And that triggered something in my brain. Obviously, it wasn't like a conscious decision, I'm going to become anorexic, but it triggered something in my brain where I started really controlling my food. First of all, I educated myself around calories. And pretty soon knew every food, how many calories it contained. And I allowed myself 1,000 calories to begin with, which I grossly overestimated. So if something, let's say an apple had 100 calories, I would say, well, just to be on the safe side, let's say it has 250, so I don't overeat. So in the beginning, I allowed myself my calculated 1,000 calories, which were probably 700. And at the same time, I started running. And I remember I had this boyfriend who was a soccer player. And he was kind of like my mother. He said, well, you're not athletic. You couldn't keep up with me. So one day I said, let me go with you. So we went, and he said, actually, you're not that bad. The second one we went, he said, can you please slow down? And I was hooked. So on top of extremely cutting my calories, I now started running. Suddenly I had these two things that I was good at. I was good at losing weight, and I was good at running. And the two, of course, compounded, and I lost weight really fast. But at first, you got that dopamine fix from eating, right? Those foods, they give you that dopamine fix. For me, starving myself and then the running on top of it gave me that dopamine fix. So nobody was going to take that away from me. And that went on for a while. I was 17 at the time. And then people started talking. And my mother, being such a narcissist, she didn't come up and say, hey, I'm so worried about you, what's going on? She came up and said, people are talking, what's the matter with you? So that, of course, didn't help. So I, did a little bit more of what I was doing, because I finally felt I have control now. That was this big part about controlling my life finally. And so eventually she put me in an inpatient clinic. We did try to go to a couple of therapists, and they all said, we're not touching this. She could die under our care. This is the early 80s. We hadn't really, obviously anorexia existed, but it wasn't that widely known. In fact, I had gone to a doctor who thought I had a tapeworm. So my mother put me in this clinic. It wasn't an eating disorder clinic. It was a psychosomatic clinic. I believe we had about 55 patients with all kinds of different ailments that the medical world had given up on. So I wasn't really forced to eat, luckily, because that wouldn't work anyways. I was free to do what I did outside the clinic. Every morning I snuck out, I went for a run, I ate very little. I sort of just bid my time in the clinic until I turned 18. And at 18 in Germany, you're an adult, and I was allowed to leave. When I said to my therapist I want to leave, he advised me not to. He said, you're by no means healthy. And I wasn't. I hadn't even gained a pound. In fact, I lost more weight in the clinic. And he said, if you must leave, I advise you to move out from home, because he knew that that was a big source of my illness. Going to that clinic allowed me to have an ally. I had this therapist that I could tell you these horrible things happened to me. But now what? I didn't have the tools. I was 18. I was a child. I remember him saying constantly, how does your inner child feel about that? And I thought, what are you talking about? What inner child? So the whole thing back then wasn't that helpful for me, because the only thing that was helpful is having that ally, finally saying these horrible things happened to me, and somebody being there for me and being on my side. But aside from that, I wasn't given any tools to change what I was doing. So when I got out of the clinic, I moved out and I continued to do what I did. Same thing. I ate very, very little. I exercised way too much. And I did that for another few years. I think I was 21 at the time that I rode my bike home from work one day and thought, I'm so exhausted by this all. I wish I was just dead. And at that very same moment, I had that thought across me. It was like, God or the universe saying, let's just see about that. So I still remember laying under that car. I was all the way under the car. I didn't have a helmet on, so I had a hole in my head. Laying under that car and looking up at the undercarriage and thinking, I changed my mind. I don't want to be dead, but I can't do this anymore. I need to get healthy. So I made myself a promise that I would get help. Mm-hmm. And so I went back to that clinic, this time on my own free will. And I spent another 6 months there. So altogether, I was inpatient for 1 year. I had the same therapist, which was helpful because he did feel like an ally at that point. And I got a little bit healthier. But still, again, we were rehearsing, this happened and this is why you are doing all these things. But now what? I didn't get the tools to go, okay, how can I shut up this voice in my head? I actually remember in the clinic sort of getting to the point myself where I had this, and you probably know this voice, I think most of us have it, but ours was very strong. This voice that just would not shut up, that just eat less, run harder, push more, and I could not shut it up. And so I remember having the idea of calling it a different name. Obviously, I knew it was my own voice, but I called it the ugliest name I could think of at the time. I sort of tried to disassociate from that voice.
That's quite a clever strategy, actually.
It did help, going, shut up, I don't want to listen to you. Again, knowing very clearly that it was my own voice, but it did help sort of giving it another name and disassociating, knowing that this is not the voice I want to listen to. I want to listen to that tiny voice that every once in a while speaks up and says, why are you doing this? This is not good for you. So that helped. And that's what I sort of did for the next couple of decades. But that voice was so powerful. It was always with me for another couple of decades. I wasn't, I would say, critically anorexic anymore, to the point where I could have died. But I exercised way too much. I had to exercise 3.5 hours a day or more, but never less. And you probably know this, when we are in this eating disorder mindset, we make these rules for ourselves that we cannot break. And if you break those rules, who knows what's going to happen? So it had to be 3.5 hours a day. I had to only eat so many calories. And again, I grossly overestimated them. So obviously I wasn't healthy. It was very challenging to have relationships because my mind was always counting calories and how much do I have to work out and all of these things. So it took me decades to get healthy and have a healthy relationship with food. And I remember sometimes, and this sounds so silly to me now, because I know that it is silly, but back then I was thinking, I wish I was an alcoholic or drug addict, because for some reason that just seemed easier. Because all you need to do is what I thought, you just don't drink or you leave the drug away. But food is something we have to eat every day, right? So learning, and for you the same thing, and no matter how messed up your relationship is with food, but learning how much to eat, how much does my body need, what kind of foods, and learning to trust that. That was the challenging part for me.
Yeah, me too. I mean, they are different disorders, but a lot of what you say resonates with me, because for me it was about trying to control my world as well. And that came out in other aspects of my life where, particularly the difficulty would really emerge in times when I was living by myself. That was there were difficult times for me. And I would notice that I had to have, clean surfaces. I couldn't have a lot of things in my fridge. I followed an exact routine every day, ate the exact same things every day. And that was obviously a trigger, those days where I fell and didn't eat, didn't stick to that kind of rigid outline for myself. Then the control would go and I would kind of spiral. But yeah, that was definitely the mindset I was in as well. And I'm curious if you were aware over those years, that loud voice in your head, that was obviously a very critical voice, as it was for me. And do you think yours stemmed from a lack of self-worth as well?
Oh, definitely. I think that is one thing that unites us all as human beings. I think deep down, I would say all of us have that fear of not being enough. And usually the people we think don't have that fear, the ones that are very, loud and they have it the most. Yeah. I think we all have that fear of just not being enough. And then you grow up the way we grew up, with guilt and with a mother that is just feeding right into that. Yeah, you're not enough. My mother always told us I would never have you again. Biggest mistake to have children. So of course, I felt like, who cares if I'm even here? So with anorexia, I think it's quite complex, and same with bulimia. It's first of all, because of the molestation I experienced, I didn't want to be a woman because it was too dangerous. Secondly, I wanted to control something finally because my mother was controlling everything. And thirdly, I think it's trying to take up as little room as possible, because you just feel like you're just too big and too loud for this world. I remember my mother always saying, when adults talk, you have to be quiet. So there's just never any space for us to be just us. And, we were too big, too much of everything. So it's also trying to take up as little space as possible and not having any needs. I don't need anything. I don't need love. I don't need food. I don't need anything.
Yeah. You were 100% in control. Or
yeah.
That's what you were trying to convince yourself, that you were 100% in control. Yeah. But it was controlling you ultimately.
Exactly. And it took me until I realized that the only thing I really have control over in life is my thoughts.
Yeah.
When I finally realized that I don't have control over anything, I can't control life. Things happen. I'll be okay for the most part. But what I can control, the one thing I can control is this. And when I finally learned that, and when I finally realized that voice that is so nasty to me, if that was an outside person, it would take me 5 seconds to say, get the hell away from me and never come back. But I did this to myself for decades.
Yeah.
And so it really took that. It took for me, it took many things. I make it sound very simple, but many, many pieces had to fall into place. But one of the pieces was, and I kind of pictured it like that, it was like changing the station on a radio. Whenever I heard that voice, I was like, no, don't want to listen to them, let's change it. And I visually pictured myself changing that knob on the radio, and it would come back, it was a very persistent voice. Nope, still don't want to listen to you. Nope, still don't want to listen to you. And it took a long time of practicing that, but that voice got a little less persistent and a little less persistent. Now I can't say it's completely gone. It's always going to be part of me, but I have learned to recognize it and realize I don't want to listen to you. You have nothing of value to say, so just shut up.
It's like now we know how to talk back to it. Because when I think about it, sometimes, at Christmas or whatever, and it's, there's so much food, and if I feel very full, that thought flashes in my head. It's not even a thought about, I don't get as far as thinking about throwing up, but there's a panic rises. What am I going to do? I'm full. What am I going to do with this? I'm going to have to process. And that's where the settling down has to happen again. It's like, it's fine, I'll digest it. I'll go for a walk, and that's what I do. Help bring down the sugar spike, and exercise, and improve my mood just by doing that. And then I carry on, and it's brought back under control again. But like you, I think that's probably always going to be around. But I hope that I would never go back to that again.
Yeah. I think eating disorder or not, we all have that inner critic. Ours is insanely powerful, and it made us do things that were really unhealthy for us. But I think all of us have that inner critic. It's realizing, first of all, that it's there, and then realizing that you don't want to listen to that, and replace that with something kinder. Start talking kinder to yourself. Again, if this was an outside person, hopefully you wouldn't let an outsider talk to you like that. So why do it to yourself? Being human is hard. We all have our struggles, whether that is around food or something else. So I think all of us have that inner critic, unfortunately.
100%. And I turn 51 next month. It took me the guts of 50 years to figure that out. And it really started with awareness of what I was doing. I knew through the therapy that I'd had when I had the eating disorder that I was being unkind to myself, and that it came from a lack of self-worth. But then that became something where I was almost criticizing myself for having that. I just didn't still have the tools to get out of it. And for me, it just came back to understanding that a lot of other people, and particularly through my work, talking to my colleagues about it, opening up, being more vulnerable with people, you realize how many other people feel the same way. And then you start to think, no, it's not just me. I'm not some strange person. I don't need to carry this shame around with me. This is, all of us contend with this to some degree. And, you know, people in very senior positions and people who have 2 million followers on Instagram or YouTube or whatever, they are still struggling with an internal critic to some degree or another. And, you know, that sense of being an imposter, bit of a lack of self-worth at times, it kind of creeps up on all of us every now and then. And I think just an awareness that, you know, there's none of us just floating through.
No.
And we can afford to be a little bit kinder to ourselves because we're all human at the end of the day.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think, you know, that you know, obviously we are talking about two extremes, you and I, bulimia and anorexia, but that kindness always also plays into people just struggling to know what to eat nowadays and gaining a couple of pounds or wanting to lose a couple of pounds. Because again, it is, in my opinion, this cycle. First of all, you crave these foods because you get that dopamine hit, or because you don't want to feel something and you want to push it down. So you eat those foods, you gain a couple of pounds and you beat yourself up. So what do you want to do? You want to feel better again. So it's this vicious cycle. But I think if we can take that voice out, or at least shut it up, maybe we can't remove it, unfortunately, but shut it up and replace it with kinder self-talk. I used to think, you know, how would I talk to my best friend? Or if I had a child, how would I talk to a child? Or to my dog, you know? I would never say those things.
No.
So let's learn to talk to myself how I would talk to my best friend or my dog or a child. And I think people struggling with weight or food issues, hopefully that could be helpful, just replacing or shutting up that inner critic and talking kinder to themselves.
Yeah.
And saying, so, okay, I slipped up today. I ate a little too much. Big whoop, you know, tomorrow I eat a little healthier.
The guilt and the blame make it worse. They compound situations. If you can at least start from, you know, this is who I am. This is where I am. Take the blame out of it. You know, there's multiple reasons why we get ourselves into these situations where we find ourselves sort of overweight or underweight or wherever we are, you know, and being highly critical of ourselves makes that situation worse. So, you know, starting with a blank sheet, and if you have a bad eating day, bad eating moment, it's okay, you know, just try and move in the right direction. If you can eat a little less sugar one day, if you can eat some more vegetables, you know, you're moving in the right direction, and congratulate yourself for that, rather than criticizing yourself for what you didn't do that day. And I think that trajectory might start to go upwards if you can, you know, if that's your starting point.
Yeah. And throw out perfectionism. I have a friend who always says perfectionism is the highest form of self-abuse. And that's true. You know, we think, I mean, anorexia is definitely about perfectionism. You know, I had to weigh a certain weight. I had to have all these things in line or else I wasn't worth anything. But now I have sort of this motto, good enough is good enough.
I mean, I'm wondering what your approach to eating now is, and how that has your past has affected it.
I look at food now as nourishment, as something, just if I had a high performing sports car, I would put the best gasoline in there. I want to do the same thing with my body. I want this very forgiving and resilient body of mine that I have abused for decades to heal still. I think it's probably still healing from that abuse, to stick around for as long as possible and to be able to do all the things I want to do. And then I eat when I'm hungry and I stop when I'm full. I don't fast. I know fasting is very popular, but for me, it surely wouldn't be good because first of all, I've been hungry for too long and I don't want to go there anymore. Another reason I don't fast is because, like I said, that little voice is always there. I've learned to shut it up, but I know that it's part of my brain chemistry. And I don't ever want to give it the chance to get louder again. So while I feel completely recovered, I just don't want to risk it. So I eat when I'm hungry. I stop when I'm full. I don't have any foods that are off limit aside from animal products, but not because they're off limit. You know, they're off limit for me for other reasons. I eat chocolate every day. I love my chocolate. So that's how I approach it. I don't know how many calories I eat. I feel that I don't have a scale. I don't weigh myself because that used to be a big part of my life too. But I feel that I'm at a healthy weight. I'm strong. I feel good. I can do everything I want to do. So that's how I approach it. Like I said, if I had a high-performing sports car, I would take good care of it. I try to do the same now with my body. How about you?
We have ended up in such a similar place. I mean, I'm not vegan. I do eat some meat and I eat fish, but the lion's share of my diet is plant-based. So I try to just eat a lot of different kinds of vegetables most days and salad and so on. And it just so happens that, if you gave me the choice, I would often go for a plate of salad if I'm in a restaurant, something like that. A nice gourmet salad with cheeses and walnuts and so on. But that floats my boat. And I think I'm kind of lucky in that way. So yeah, just getting a great variety of whole foods, natural foods, largely plant-based, and trying to get a good amount of protein as well. There's Greek yogurt in there. I eat quite a few nuts in a day, really love nuts. But these are the things that kind of fuel me, and then I don't get these big hunger dips. So I'm just kind of sustained. And like you, I kind of eat when I'm hungry as well. So I don't keep track of what I've eaten in a day. I don't count calories. I'm just kind of aware. I don't really try and balance things out nutritionally. That might be another step for me, but I do feel that if I went down that route of trying to be very controlled I might end up in a difficult position. So I think you and I have fallen back on our instinct. We have just leaned into nature, like nature knows best. I'm just going to stick with these foods that it's provided for me, stay away from the processed stuff. Like you, I love chocolate. I also have chocolate every day. Mainly it's dark chocolate, but from time to time I'll have the milk chocolate because I love that too. And I don't give myself a hard time for it. So I'll eat something sweet every day. And I feel like that's kind of something maybe not that I need to do, but it is a part of eating for enjoyment and eating for fuel. And so when people kind of fall out over, the kind of micro points of eating, whether almonds are good for us or not, or whether we should be eating oatmeal, I kind of look at it like, if you can eat a diet that is kind of whole food based and you're cutting out the processed stuff, cutting down on sugar and so on, that's a really good starting point. We don't have to get into a fight over the granular details. I mean, if most people were doing that, it would be great for national health, basically. So I think just focusing on the bigger picture first is really, really helpful, and not getting too caught up in the calories and, specific foods within that mix. That's certainly how I work it, because I think what I'm doing is good enough, and good enough for you and I is the most important thing. Yeah.
I mentioned how I got to the point where I'm at now. Lots of pieces had to fall into place, more therapy. The right and the wrong people coming into my life to teach me a lesson and do some more therapy on that. But how did you get to that point where you are now?
It sort of naturally stopped for me, the actual eating disorder, by the time I'd reached my later 20s. So, I said earlier, I could get the odd flare up at that point, which would be an emotional trigger. So I remember, for instance, when I was probably about 27, so it might not have happened in over a year. And there was a guy in my office that gave me a particularly hard time over something one day. And I mean, inexplicably, and this is why I equated it with alcoholism when we were speaking before, inexplicably, I got up and I walked to a store and I picked up a bunch of junk food and I went home and I ate it. And, I unfortunately brought it back up. That was my release. There was a trigger and that was my release. And I felt awful about myself afterwards. The whole shame comes back again. And, oh, this is you. But I think that was probably the last time, interestingly. And I met my husband, I had kids, and being part of a family unit gave me a lot. You know, having a partner, and that helped me for a start. But then I think being able to piece together how to eat, you know, just growing knowledge and awareness around food, falling back on my instincts, starting to trust food more, it just sort of all came together for me. Because even during my 30s, I would have, and well into my 40s, would have been highly self-critical, really giving myself a hard time. I cannot even begin to set out for people. And I'm sure a lot of people actually empathize and can relate. You know, every piece of work I produced as a journalist, I would be sort of really hung up over the details and reading it and rereading it and worrying about it, worrying that everything I did wasn't good enough. That's how it felt for me. So, you know, it has been a lot of unpicking to let it go and just say, I'm okay. You know, my intentions are good, and I do the best I can, and that's enough, you know. So it's been a whole mix of things, really, leading me to a point where I can kind of feel better about myself. You know, I can still beat myself up in my brain from time to time, but I don't take it out through food. I have noticed, I think, sometimes when I'm feeling a bit down or whatever, that I'll eat more chocolate. I'll eat some, you know, I'll eat more kind of bad stuff. But I suppose the difference now is fat isn't so big a problem for me, because I know that's okay. I can go through this now. That's all right. It's not a big issue. I'll pick up again tomorrow, and I don't let it become too much of a thing in my mind.
And, you know, you said when you don't feel so good, you eat more chocolate. Again, it's normal because that hits your dopamine receptors and makes you feel better. Absolutely. So it's not really your fault, you know, that is just how food is affecting us, our body chemistry. Yeah. But you said that you would beat yourself up and that your intentions are good. And I just read, and I probably am misquoting it, but somebody said, I don't know who this person was, but they said, don't measure yourself by your work, measure yourself by your intentions.
Yes. Yes, that was one that we talked about the other day. It came, I think, from Wayne Dyer, who was a big self-development expert. And I'd heard somebody talking about it on a podcast. I think it was Ed Milet. And I thought that is absolutely brilliant, because I listened to a lot of these big self-development coaches. And what is so interesting, the best ones are the ones that stand up and say, I still have bad days. I teach people how to do this. And I still have days where I'm criticizing myself and tearing myself down. And when you understand that about some of the people that appear most confident and have it together and are worth multi-millions, and they still feel like that, then maybe the rest of us aren't so bad for feeling the same way.
I think we could talk about this forever. And like I said, we are continuing this conversation on your channel. But I have one more question for you. And it's a question actually a viewer asked me. And she asked, how has my eating disorder, my past eating disorder, affected my aging? As far as, you know, my biological age, my skin health. I'm not quite sure what she wanted to know exactly, but how do you feel? Do you feel it has negatively affected the way your body has aged? Or?
It's a really interesting question, that, because, you know, it was kind of on and off for me. And I smoked and I drank heavily in my 20s as well. So neither of these things were helpful. And in some ways I've thought about this and thought, I think, you know, I've kind of skin wise got away with that quite lightly. I think it was harder for me to balance my weight because it had been so disrupted. I think it was hard to get things settled down, but I've kind of reached that equilibrium now. But otherwise, I think I've possibly come out of it okay. It's hard to say, isn't it? It's hard to say, but I feel okay. Yeah. How about you?
It's hard to say now, because I do feel that at the end I came out of it okay. But definitely for decades I struggled with my hormones. I was a late bloomer. I didn't get a period until I was 17. And then not only did my mother put me on the pill, so my body didn't produce its own hormones, but I became anorexic right away. So I think my body just never quite figured out how to make its own hormones. At 26, I went off the pill. and I got brittle bones. So I already had osteoporosis at age 26. So I think I really screwed up my endocrine system with that. I've been on thyroid hormones and hormone replacement therapy since age 38, well, really before, because of the pill. So that definitely, and for the longest time, I did feel that lack of estrogen. Luckily, my bones, when I got back on the pill and then on hormone replacement, luckily my bones are okay because of all the exercise I've done.
Right.
But I did feel it affected my skin for quite a while. I do feel I have done quite a bit to my skin now. I've been kinder to my skin now too, because just how I wasn't kind to my body, I wasn't kind to my skin. So I do feel I have repaired some of that damage. But yeah, it's hard to know. Sometimes I think, would I have not done that? Would I look 20 years younger? Who knows? Yeah, it's hard to say. And nobody's perfect. We've all done things in the past that probably affect the way we age. But I did think it was an interesting question when she asked me that.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I also think we can't afford to have regrets, because that just
Exactly.
feeds into the whole sense of worth and so on. I think we've just got to say, you know, we are who we are. We've come through what we've come through, and it helps give us empathy and understanding for what other people are going through. And, you know, talking about this today, I hope that people will now understand that, you know, when we are talking about aging well and nutrition and so on, we're not just two people sort of pontificating who've come from some sort of glorious place of perfection. You know, we're two people who have come through kind of enormous struggle with this, and you know, are absolutely far from perfect. So, you know, nobody should feel bad listening to what we're talking about. Sometimes I think, you know, you can listen to people talking about nutrition and what they do and so on, and it can feed the fear of you thinking, oh, I'm not doing that and I'm not doing as well as them. And, you know, none of that. we're all doing the best we can where we are right now, and we find our way. You know, with awareness, we start to find the way.
I agree 100%. And this is a great place to stop. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me, Claire. I really appreciate it. And I really hope it helps some people. And like I said, we are continuing this conversation on your channel. So your video is coming out a couple of days after mine, but I will link it down below in the info box as soon as it comes out. And please go over and watch Claire's channel, Claire's video, and subscribe to Claire if you haven't already. She is lovely, and I've really, really loved to get to know you better. And I love having you as a friend.
Yeah, so, I know, Claudia, I can feel the emotion rising, because I'm so glad I met you. We have so much in common, and it's just wonderful to have a friend like you. So thank you.
Thank you.